Hello everybody, and welcome to the Friday edition of Video Clips. Just a couple things I'll mention to you just to remind you, it is coming upon fall semester soon. You can start our career training anytime, but this is the time when a lot of people think about it. And a lot of folks, because of what's going on, have been thinking a lot about the importance of truth-telling in healthcare and how nice it is to be on the right side of telling the truth. And people both in healthcare and who would like to be in healthcare can take our classes and learn how to do what we're doing, which is tell people the truth about things so they can make smart decisions. And by the way, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything here. I'm just reporting the news. You make of it what you make of it. So today I'm going to report news that was reported by the New York Times, a very mainstream media outlet, and involves researchers at Dartmouth and very traditional medical centers. So again, we're looking at data that is sanctioned and endorsed by all. Okay, so this isn't conspiracy theory, but I think you'll get where I'm going with this as I go through this information with you. So Dr. Brooke Herndon, an internist at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, couldn't stop coughing. For 2 weeks starting in mid-April in 2006, she coughed seemingly nonstop, followed by another week when she coughed sporadically. Annoying, she said, everybody who worked with her. Before long, Dr. Catherine Kirkland, an infectious disease specialist at Dartmouth, had a chilling thought. Could she be seeing the start of a whooping cough epidemic? By late April, other healthcare workers at the hospital were coughing, and severe intractable coughing is a whooping cough hallmark if you've ever known somebody who had whooping cough. If it were whooping cough, the epidemic had to be contained immediately because the disease could be deadly to babies in the hospital. And of course, the hospital had frail elderly people like hospitals do, and it could definitely be fatal to them. So the story, the New York Times calls this the story of the epidemic that wasn't. For months, nearly everyone involved thought the medical center had a huge whooping cough outbreak with extensive ramifications. Nearly 1,000 healthcare workers at the hospital were given preliminary tests and furloughed from work until the results were in. 142 people, including Dr. Herndon, were told that they appeared to have the disease, and thousands of people, as a result of this, were given antibiotics and a vaccine for protection. Hospital beds were taken out of commission, including some in intensive care. Remember, this is 2006. Then, about 8 months later, healthcare workers were dumbfounded to receive an email message from hospital administration informing them that the whole thing was a false alarm. Not a single case of whooping cough was confirmed with a definitive test growing the bacterium, Bordetella pertussis, in the laboratory. Instead, it appears that the healthcare workers were probably afflicted with ordinary respiratory diseases like the common cold. Now, as they look back on the episode, epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists say the problem was that they placed too much faith in a quick and highly sensitive molecular test that led them astray. And it was the PCR test that's being used now. Dr. Trish Pearl, an epidemiologist at Johns Hopkins and past president of the Society of Healthcare Epidemiologists of America, said pseudo-epidemics happen all the time. The Dartmouth case may have been one of the largest, but it was no means an exception, she said. Well, it was the largest up until now. There was a similar whooping cough scare at Children's Hospital in Boston that involved 36 adults and 2 children. Definitive tests, though, did not find pertussis. It's a problem. We know it's a problem, Dr. Pearl said. My guess is that what happened at Dartmouth is going to become more common. Boy, psychic powers there, right? Many of the new molecular tests are quick but technically demanding, and each laboratory may do them in its own way. But the false positives are likely, and when hundreds or thousands of people are tested, as occurred at Dartmouth, false positives can make it seem like there's an epidemic. You're in a little bit of no man's land with the new molecular tests, said Dr. Mark Perkins, an infectious disease specialist and chief scientific officer at the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, a nonprofit foundation supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. All bets are off on exact performance. Of course, that leads to the question of why rely on them at all. At face value, obviously, they shouldn't be doing it, Dr. Pearl said. But often when answers are needed and an organism like pertussis bacterium is finicky and hard to grow in a laboratory, you don't have great options. It's almost like you're trying to pick the least of two evils, Dr. Pearl said. At Dartmouth, the decision was to use a test, the PCR test, for polymerase chain reaction. It's a molecular test that until recently was confined to molecular biology laboratories. That's kind of what's happening, said Dr. Catherine Edwards, an infectious disease specialist and professor of pediatrics at Vanderbilt University. That's the reality out there. We're trying to figure out how to use methods that have been the purview of bench scientists. The person who developed this test, by the way, Dr. Carrie Mullis, said it was for laboratory use only. It had no value as a diagnostic test. To say that the episode was disruptive is an understatement, says Dr. Elizabeth Talbot, Deputy State Epidemiologist for the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services. Now remember, this was at the time in 2006 when this whole episode took place. You cannot imagine, Dr. Talbot said, I had a feeling at the time this gave us a shadow of a hint of what it might be like during pandemic flu season, or during a pandemic flu epidemic, she said. Yet, epidemiologists say one of the most troubling aspects of the pseudo-epidemic is that all the decisions seemed so sensible at the time. Before the 1940s, when a pertussis vaccine for children was introduced, whooping cough was a leading cause of death in young children. The vaccine led to an 80% drop in the disease's incidence, but didn't eliminate it. That's because the vaccine's effectiveness wears off. And although there's now a new vaccine, it's only starting to come into use, whooping cough is still a concern. And so the bottom line is they ended up with 134 suspect cases. And that's why 1,445 healthcare workers ended up taking antibiotics, which have side effects. And 4,524 healthcare workers at the hospital, or 72% of all healthcare workers there, were immunized against whooping cough in a matter of days. So this was forced on these people based on an inaccurate test that all of these top epidemiologists, they're all with, this isn't me talking, I'm reading to you what the New York Times reported that these people said in response to this episode. And they actually said that it was concerning, and it might be very concerning if we actually ever did have a pandemic. All right, if we had stopped there, I think we would have agreed that we had an outbreak of pertussis and we had controlled it. But epidemiologists at the hospital and working for the states of New Hampshire and Vermont decided to take extra steps to confirm what they were seeing was really pertussis. So they sent samples from 27 patients they thought had pertussis to the state health departments and the Centers for Disease Control. Their scientists tried to grow the bacteria, a process that can take weeks. Finally, they had their answer. There was no pertussis in any of the samples. We thought, well, that's odd, Dr. Kirkland said. Maybe it's the timing of the culturing. Maybe it's a transport problem. Why don't we try serological testing? Certainly after a pertussis infection, a person should develop antibodies to the bacteria. They could get suitable blood samples from 39 patients. The others had gotten the vaccine itself, so they had to get it from people who hadn't. But when the Centers for Disease Control tested the 39 samples, the scientists reported only one showed increases in antibody levels indicating that they have pertussis. The disease center did additional tests on top of that, including molecular tests to look for features of the pertussis bacteria. Its scientists did additional PCR tests on samples from 116 of the 134 people who were thought to have it. Only one PCR was positive, but the other tests did not show that anyone was infected with pertussis. So what I'm telling you is that after they figured out what happened, you had a fake epidemic of whooping cough. And we ended up with 1,445 people given antibiotics which have side effects for something they didn't have, because the common cold is not helped with antibiotics. Then you had 4,524 people got a vaccine for whooping cough, forced to do it because they were healthcare workers. When they found out that there was no whooping cough, they said that can't be, so they tested not just one time. They sent samples to the CDC, the Department of Health. They used multiple methods of trying to track down whooping cough. We couldn't find any whooping cough, all right? So it never happened. So it basically said, Dr. Kirkland said, it was going on for months, but in the end, the conclusion was clear. There was no pertussis epidemic. We were all somewhat surprised, Dr. Kirkland said, and we were left in a very frustrating situation about what to do when the next outbreak comes. Dr. Kathy Petty, an infectious disease specialist at the University of Utah, said the story had one clear lesson, quote, "The big message is that every lab is vulnerable to having false positives. No single test result is absolute. And that's even more important with a test result based on PCR." So I'll tell you this about the PCR test. Our emperor, Mr. DeWine, the Emperor DeWine, last week had 2 tests in one day. One showed positive, one showed negative. He decided to choose the one he liked, which was negative, and because you get to do that when you're the emperor, you don't have to do anything that makes any sense. And the one he chose was the PCR test, which showed that he was negative, and then he was on the air every day and sending out news releases about how accurate that PCR test is. And I'm telling you, since 2006, at major medical institutions all over the country, it was known that this test was inaccurate. These scientists predicted that someday this is going to become a problem if these tests were ever used when there was something going on. And what did we learn from this? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. We're doing it again, only this time we're doing it with hundreds of millions of people. We're destroying their lives, we're destroying their businesses, we're destroying their children's education, we're destroying their psychological welfare. We're actually seeing people die as a result of this. It's shameful. What's really shameful is when we knew all along and we did it anyway. All right, I think that's enough for the week. As usual, give this to other people, turn other people onto this channel who need to know the truth about all this stuff. Remember, we post on BitChute and also on Parler. And visit our website at WellnessForumHealth.com, MakeAmericans.FreeAgain.com. Thank you so much for watching, and I will be back to you next week with more news.